Every morning, millions of people wake up before the alarm not because they are rested, but because their lower back speaks first. Stiff, tight, aching, as if the body spent the night preparing pain instead of healing. And the question we quietly ask is not dramatic or philosophical, but deeply human. Why does rest sometimes leave us worse than effort? The first idea is that morning back pain is not caused by sleep itself, but by how the nervous system and connective tissues behave during long stillness. As the body begins to accept this gentler dialogue each morning, something subtle but powerful starts to happen beneath awareness. The nervous system lowers its guard, not suddenly, but gradually, like a hand unclenching after holding tension for years. And this shift alone can change how pain is experienced before any muscle length truly changes. When we talk about morning pain, we often imagine stiff muscles as the main culprit, but science keeps pointing us back to something deeper and quieter. Sensitivity, the sensitivity of tissues, nerves, and the brain itself after hours of reduced sensory input. During sleep, the brain receives far less information from movement receptors. Joints barely change angle, muscles remain mostly still, and when sensory input drops, sensitivity rises. Just as eyes become sensitive to light after darkness, the body becomes sensitive to movement after stillness. This is why the first movements of the day can feel exaggerated. A small bend feels large, a simple twist feels sharp, and the body is not fragile in that moment. It is simply uncalibrated, and calibration is a neurological process, not a mechanical one. Stretching works here not because it forces range, but because it feeds the brain information slowly, accurately, and without threat. Gentle stretches activate receptors and muscles and joints that inform the brain about position and load. And when these receptors fire in a calm, controlled way, they compete with pain signals, not by masking them, but by rebalancing the sensory conversation. This is why slow stretching often reduces pain even before flexibility improves. The system is being reminded that movement is safe. There's also an emotional layer to morning pain that rarely gets acknowledged. Mornings carry memory. If pain has been present for weeks or months, the body begins to anticipate it, and anticipation itself can increase muscle tone and sensitivity before movement even begins. This is not weakness or imagination. It is learned protection, and safe stretching helps unlearn it. When movement is slow and predictable, the brain updates its internal models. It learns that the spine can bend without consequence, that muscles can lengthen without injury, and that the day does not begin with danger, and this learning accumulates over time, like compound interest applied to health rather than money. Another overlooked aspect is temperature. Body temperature drops during sleep, and connective tissue behaves differently when cooler. Collagen becomes less extensible, viscosity increases, and resistance to movement rises. Gentle stretching increases local temperature through blood flow, warming tissues naturally without strain, making subsequent movements smoother and less reactive. This warming effect is not just physical. It is neurological. Warmth signals safety to the nervous system. Cold often signals threat, and many people wake in cool rooms, stiff and guarded, beginning the day in a mild defensive state. Slow movement counteracts this, telling the system that it is time to shift from protection to participation. Hydration also plays a quiet role. Discs and fascia rely on water to glide and distribute force, and after hours without fluid intake, tissues can feel less forgiving. Gentle movement helps redistribute internal fluids, encouraging exchange and lubrication. Another reason aggressive stretching first thing can backfire, while soft movement succeeds. What makes morning stretching powerful is not the stretch itself, but the timing. The body is most plastic when transitioning between states. Sleep to wakefulness is one such window, and what you introduce during this window often sets the tone for hours that follow. This is why a few minutes of mindful movement can influence pain levels throughout the entire day. From a scientific perspective, this aligns with how the brain prioritizes early input. The first signals after rest help establish baseline expectations. If those signals are calm and controlled, the nervous system maintains a lower threat level. If they are abrupt or painful, vigilance increases and pain often persists. There is a philosophical humility in this process. It asks us to stop treating the body as a machine that must be forced into performance, and instead recognize it as a living system that responds to tone, timing, and trust. Morning stretching becomes less about doing and more about listening. Over time, people who adopt this approach often notice something unexpected. The pain does not just decrease in the morning. It loses its authority. It stops defining the start of the day. Movement feels less like a negotiation and more like a natural return to self, and this psychological shift feeds back into physical healing. The science of pain increasingly shows that recovery is not linear. It is adaptive, and safe daily stretches provide the consistent input that adaptation requires. Not dramatic change, but reliable reassurance. This is why the most effective stretches often look almost too simple. Small spinal waves, gentle hip movements, slow transitions from lying to sitting, movements that seem insignificant to an observer, but are profoundly meaningful to the nervous system. When done daily, these movements stop being exercises and start becoming rituals, signals that tell the body each morning that it is supported, that it does not need to brace against the day, and that movement can unfold without fear. In this way, healing the back becomes less about fixing a problem and more about restoring a relationship between brain and body that was disrupted by pain, stress, or misunderstanding. And safe stretching is a language through which that relationship is rebuilt. The body does not ask for perfection. It asks for consistency. And when it receives that consistency each morning, it often responds with resilience that surprises even those who have lived with pain for years. When we move into the second idea, the conversation shifts from structure to communication. Because the real power of safe stretching does not live in how far a muscle can lengthen, but in how clearly the brain and body can speak to each other. And pain often emerges not from tightness itself, but from confusion within this dialogue. The human body is wired for movement that is varied, rhythmic, and responsive, yet modern life trains us into long periods of stillness followed by abrupt effort. And this contrast disrupts the natural feedback loops between muscles, joints, and the nervous system, especially in the lower back, where stability depends more on coordination than strength. Gentle stretching works because it restores this coordination without triggering alarm. When movements are slow and controlled, the brain receives accurate information about joint angles, muscle tension, and load, and this clarity reduces the need for protective stiffness, which is one of the primary drivers of chronic morning pain. At the level of the spinal cord, sensory input from stretching competes with pain signals through well-documented inhibitory pathways. But this is not a battle where pain is suppressed. It is a recalibration where movement signals regain priority, reminding the system that the back exists to move, not to freeze. This is why stretches that involve rocking, rolling, and smooth transitions are often more effective than static holds early in the day. Dynamic movement provides continuous feedback, allowing the nervous system to adjust in real time, whereas static intensity can feel ambiguous and provoke guarding. Breathing plays a central role here. Slow stretches naturally invite slower breathing, and slow breathing directly influences the vagus nerve, shifting the body toward a parasympathetic state, a state associated with repair, digestion, and reduced pain sensitivity. When breathing deepens, muscle tone often drops without conscious effort. The lower back is deeply connected to the diaphragm through facial and neurological links. When breathing is shallow, stabilizing muscles around the spine tend to overwork, creating a sense of tightness that stretching alone cannot resolve. But when movement and breath are paired gently, the entire system reorganizes. Another important factor is timing and intention. Stretching done with urgency or frustration sends a very different signal than stretching done with curiosity. The brain is sensitive to emotional context, and movement performed in a calm state is processed differently than the same movement performed under stress. This helps explain why some people stretch daily yet see little improvement, while others notice relief with less effort. The difference often lies not in technique, but in nervous system state. Safe stretching works best when it feels non-threatening, almost boring, because boredom signals safety. The spine itself is not a rigid column, but a chain of adaptable segments. Each segment contributes a small amount of movement, and pain often arises when movement is concentrated in a few segments, while others remain stiff. Gentle stretching distributes motion more evenly, reducing overload without forcing range. From a scientific standpoint, this redistribution of movement lowers shear forces, improves joint nutrition, and reduces localized inflammation over time, but these changes occur gradually. They're the result of repeated exposure to safe movement rather than isolated sessions. Morning is an ideal time for this process because the system is already in a low-noise state. Distractions are minimal, and sensory input stands out more clearly. The nervous system is listening closely at this hour, and what it hears matters. Stretching that focuses on awareness rather than effort strengthens proprioception, the sense of where the body is in space, and strong proprioception is associated with reduced injury risk and lower pain sensitivity. because the brain feels more confident in its predictions. This confidence is not psychological bravado. It is neurological efficiency. When the brain predicts movement accurately, it does not need to overprotect, and pain decreases as a byproduct of this efficiency. Over time, safe stretching becomes less about flexibility and more about fluency. The body moves more smoothly. Transitions feel easier, and the back stops feel like a problem area and starts feeling like part of a coordinated whole. This is why effective stretching routines often feel more like flowing sequences and isolated drills. Flow allows the nervous system to stay engaged without being overwhelmed, creating a state where learning can occur. In this way, stretching becomes a form of education for the body, teaching it how to move again with trust, and pain, which once felt dominant and unpredictable, gradually loses its influence as communication improves. The second keynote, then, is not about doing more, but about listening better, because when the body feels heard, it often stops shouting through pain. The third idea invites us to rethink a belief that quietly fuels much of morning back pain. The belief that the spine is fragile, easily damaged, and in constant need of protection, when in reality the spine is one of the most adaptable structures in the human body, designed to tolerate load, motion, and variation, and pain often emerges not because the spine is weak, but because it has been treated as if it were. From a biological perspective, the spine is a dynamic system. Vertebrae, discs, ligaments, and muscles work together to distribute forces across multiple segments. No single structure carries the burden alone unless movement is restricted elsewhere. And when movement is limited, the nervous system responds by increasing muscle tone, creating stiffness that feels like protection, but often becomes the source of discomfort. Morning pain intensifies this narrative of fragility, because stiffness feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability invites caution, but caution easily becomes fear, and fear alters movement patterns before pain even appears. Muscles brace, breathing shortens, and the spine is held rigid, increasing compressive forces that the body then interprets as a threat. Safe stretching challenges this cycle gently, not by proving strength through force, but by demonstrating resilience through controlled motion. Each safe movement becomes evidence that the spine can bend, rotate, and extend without harm, and this evidence accumulates in the nervous system like data points in a scientific experiment. The science of mechanotransduction helps explain this process. Tissues respond to mechanical signals by adapting their structure and behavior, but the signal must be appropriate. Too little movement leads to stiffness and degeneration. Too much force leads to irritation. Safe stretching provides a middle ground where tissues receive information without overload. Discs, often blamed for back pain, are especially responsive to this kind of input. Gentle movement helps distribute fluid within them, improving nutrient exchange and reducing pressure concentration. This does not happen instantly, but over days and weeks of consistent movement, the internal environment of the spine becomes more forgiving. Ligaments and connective tissues also adapt. When exposed to gentle, repeated tension, they become more resilient and better aligned along lines of stress. This alignment improves force transmission and reduces the likelihood of localized strain. But again, this requires patience rather than intensity. One of the most powerful effects of safe stretching is its influence on spinal reflexes. The body relies on reflexive muscle activation to stabilize the spine during movement. When pain is present, these reflexes become exaggerated and uncoordinated. Stretching performed slowly retrains these reflexes, restoring timing rather than increasing strength. This restoration of timing matters more than muscle size or flexibility. A well-timed muscle protects the spine more effectively than a strong but poorly coordinated one, and morning stretching provides the low-stress environment necessary for this retraining. The idea of fragility also leads many people to avoid certain movements entirely. Bending, twisting, or extending are often labeled as dangerous, yet these are natural components of spinal function. Avoiding them concentrates movement into fewer patterns, increasing wear and sensitivity in those areas. Safe stretching reintroduces these movements gradually, within comfortable ranges, allowing the spine to experience variety again. Variety is nourishment for joints. It distributes load, maintains tissue health, and reduces monotony that leads to overuse. There is also a cognitive dimension here. Beliefs shape perception. When someone believes their back is fragile, every sensation is filtered through that lens. Neutral sensations become alarming, and the brain responds accordingly. Stretching that feels safe helps update these beliefs, replacing fear with familiarity. This is not positive thinking. It is evidence-based learning. The nervous system updates its models based on experience, and repeated safe experiences are the most reliable way to change those models. Over time, as confidence in movement grows, muscle guarding decreases, circulation improves, and the spine operates within a wider margin of comfort, pain becomes less frequent and less intense, not because the spine was fixed, but because it was allowed to function as designed. The third keynote reminds us that resilience is built through exposure, not avoidance, and that the spine, when treated with respect rather than fear, often responds with strength that feels almost forgotten. Morning back pain loses its grip when the day begins with movement that reinforces capability rather than vulnerability, allowing the spine to step into motion with trust instead of tension. The fourth idea turns our attention to something subtle yet powerful that shapes morning back pain more than most people realize. The quiet world of circulation, hydration, and pressure that unfolds in the body while we sleep, because what we feel upon waking is often less about injury and more about fluid dynamics. During the night, as the body lies still, gravity no longer pulls fluids downward in the same way it does during the day. Blood, lymph, and interstitial fluids redistribute. Discs in the spine absorb water and swell slightly. Connective tissues become more hydrated. And this internal shift is healthy and necessary. Yet it also changes how tissues respond to movement in the morning. A hydrated disc is a resilient disc, but it is also a more pressurized disc, and pressure without movement can create a sense of stiffness or sensitivity, especially when the first movements of the day are abrupt. Safe stretching provides a gradual way to equalize this pressure, allowing fluids to redistribute smoothly rather than suddenly. Circulation also slows during prolonged stillness. Muscles receive less blood flow, metabolic byproducts accumulate, and tissues cool slightly. None of this causes damage, but it does alter sensation. The body feels heavier, tighter, less responsive, and pain can emerge as a signal to move rather than a warning to stop. Gentle movement increases local circulation without overwhelming the system. It brings oxygen to tissues, carries away metabolites, and warms muscles naturally. This warming effect reduces resistance to movement and lowers the sensitivity of pain receptors, often within minutes. Hydration at the tissue level depends on movement. Fascia, in particular, relies on compression and release to maintain its glide. Without movement, it becomes more viscous, less able to transmit force smoothly. Stretching restores this glide by encouraging fluid exchange, turning stiffness into suppleness through simple physics. Morning back pain is often worse in people who wake and immediately rush into activity, because the transition from stillness to load is too fast for fluid systems to adapt. Stretching slows this transition, creating a buffer that protects tissues from sudden pressure changes. There is also a link between circulation and the nervous system. Improved blood flow supports neural function, enhancing signal clarity and reducing noise that the brain might interpret as pain. This is why even light movement can create a sense of relief that feels disproportionate to the effort involved. Sleep position plays a role as well. Certain positions can limit circulation or create asymmetrical pressure on tissues, leading to localized stiffness. Safe stretching helps restore symmetry by encouraging balanced movement and equal fluid distribution. This process is not about flushing toxins or dramatic detoxification. It is about restoring normal physiological flow. The body thrives on flow. When fluids move, tissues communicate. And when communication improves, pain often diminishes. Stretching in the morning can be seen as a gentle internal massage, one that uses movement rather than force to encourage circulation. It respects the body's natural rhythms rather than fighting them. From a broader perspective, this reminds us that health is often about transitions, not extremes. The body struggles when changes are abrupt and thrives when they are gradual. Morning stretching works because it honors this principle at the level of fluid, tissue, and nerve. As circulation improves and pressure equalizes, the back begins to feel lighter, more responsive, less guarded. Pain does not vanish instantly, but it softens, loses urgency, and becomes easier to move through. The fourth keynote teaches us that stiffness is not an enemy. It is a state, and states can be changed gently one movement at a time, when the body is allowed to flow back into motion without being rushed. The fifth idea brings everything together by shifting our attention away from fixing and toward learning, because long-lasting relief from morning back pain rarely comes from correcting a single muscle or perfecting a single stretch. It comes from teaching the body how to trust movement again, and trust is built through experience, not instruction. The human nervous system is constantly predicting what will happen next. Every movement is preceded by an expectation, and when pain has been present in the morning for long enough, the system begins to expect threat before the body even moves. Muscles activate early, joints stiffen, and breathing becomes shallow, all in preparation for pain that may not yet exist. Safe daily stretching interrupts this predictive loop by offering the nervous system a new set of experiences, movements that are calm, repeatable, and free of consequence. Each successful movement updates the brain predictions, teaching it that bending, rolling, or rising from bed does not automatically lead to danger. This process is gradual because learning is gradual. The brain prioritizes patterns that repeat, not events that are dramatic. One aggressive stretch followed by days of avoidance teaches very little. But gentle stretching every morning teaches the system reliability, and reliability is the foundation of trust. There is a powerful psychological shift that occurs when movement becomes predictable rather than uncertain. Uncertainty fuels pain sensitivity. Predictability reduces it. This is why routines matter. Not because the body demands rigidity, but because the nervous system finds safety in consistency. Stretching performed at the same time each morning becomes a signal, a cue that tells the system what comes next. Over time, the body begins to prepare for movement rather than brace against it. Muscle tone adjusts more smoothly, and transitions feel less abrupt. The concept of healing through learning also explains why pain can return during stressful periods even without physical strain. Stress alters predictions, increasing vigilance and sensitivity, but a well-established stretching routine provides an anchor, a familiar input that reassures the system when other signals become chaotic. Safe stretching also changes how individuals relate to their bodies. Instead of viewing the back as a problem to be managed, it becomes a system to be understood. This shift reduces frustration and self-criticism, emotional states that are known to amplify pain perception. From a neurobiological standpoint, learning safe movement strengthens inhibitory pathways in the brain that modulate pain. These pathways become more efficient with use. Just like any other skill, stretching becomes a form of neural training, refining how the brain interprets sensory input. This neural efficiency has physical consequences. Muscles stop overreacting, joints move more freely, and posture adjusts without conscious effort. The back feels less like a fragile structure and more like a responsive one. Healing, in this sense, is not a return to a previous state, but an evolution toward better coordination and awareness. Many people discover that their movement quality improves beyond what it was before pain began, because the learning process deepens body awareness. Morning stretching thus becomes a daily lesson, not a chore. Each session reinforces the message that the body is capable, adaptable, and worthy of patience. Pain gradually loses its role as a warning, because the conditions that require that warning have changed. The fifth keynote reminds us that the body does not resist healing. It resists being rushed. When we replace urgency with curiosity and force with consistency, the nervous system follows, and movement becomes easier not because pain was defeated, but because it was no longer needed to guide behavior.